Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome all of you this evening to what I'm sure will be a fascinating roundtable on the implications of the recent election in the United States. I am Jeffry Frieden. I am a professor of government in the Department of Government here at Harvard University. I'm also the chair of the Department of Government at this point. Most of my work is on international economics and international politics, but today we're going to focus on domestic issues in the United States in the light of the recent election. We have 5 outstanding specialists in American politics to join us, and I'm going to introduce them one by one, giving a brief biographies of all of them as we start. I will then turn to them in order, in alphabetical order by last name, for some brief comments on their interpretation of the implications of the election, after which we'll have some conversation and pick up some questions from the audience. Before we go any farther, however, I'd like to thank those members of the Harvard Alumni Association and the Harvard Alumni Association for watching us on the Harvard Alumni Association YouTube channel. Welcome. Welcome to all of you who are listening. So with no further ado, here are our 5 panelists. First, Danielle Allen. Danielle is director of Harvard's Edmond Safra Center for Ethics and a professor of government who specializes in political theory and political philosophy. She's especially interested in the past, present, and future of democracy and democratic theory. Danielle co-chaired the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission's report on Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. Second, we have Stephen Ansolabehere. Steve is the Frank Thompson Professor of Government and Director of the Center for American Politics here at Harvard University. Steve specializes in American elections, public opinion, and representation. Most recently, he's the author of Congressional Representation in the American Journal of Political Science and of the 2020 Cooperative Election Survey. Next, we have Ryan Enos. Ryan is a professor of government here in the Department of Government at Harvard. Ryan specializes in psychology, political psychology, geography, and voting in the United States. His most recent book is The Space Between Us, Social Geography and Politics. Next, Roger Porter, who is the IBM Professor of Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School, and who teaches a legendary course, I might say, on the American presidency. Roger specializes in the American presidency and in domestic and international economic policy. He has served for more than 11 years in the West Wing of the White House as a senior economic advisor and has been involved, I think, in several presidential transitions. Roger's the author of Presidential Decision Making. And finally, Theda R Skocpol, who is the Victor Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology and the director of the Scholars Strategy Network. Theda works on current US politics, public policy, and civic life, most recently the Tea Party, the politics of the Affordable Care Act and its implementation, the radicalization of the Republican Party, and the spread of the grassroots anti-Trump resistance after November 2016. Theda's most recent book, co-edited with Caroline Turvo, is called Upending American Politics, Polarizing Parties, Ideological Elites, and Citizen Activists, from the Tea Party to the anti-Trump resistance. So those are our panelists. I will look forward with all of you to hearing what they have to say about the implications of the recent election. I'm going to turn first to Danielle Allen. Danielle, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and it's good to be here with all of you. The important things are ones I think we're all familiar with at this point in time. For me, among the most important features of the election are the incredible turnout, highest in 120 years. The projections at this point put us probably at something like 66.7% for our turnout levels. So, nearly a supermajority of the electorate, which is an extraordinary thing. And it's not merely that the turnout was so great. Of course, this is the first turnout at that level that has also included women in the electorate, Native Americans, Asian Americans, people of color fully enfranchised. So it's also the biggest portion of the population that's ever voted. And indeed, we saw turnout increase across a number of categories. Young voters, for example, increased their turnout from something like 44% in 2016 to 52 to 53% in this election, which is an incredible jump. And similarly, we can expect there to be a significant upward movement for people without college degrees. People of color had very strong turnout. So in that regard, we've had the sort of whole electorate, so to speak, in the conversation for the first time. That's historically monumental. From a civic education point of view, an area I care about, that is a transformative moment. We've been, many of us, banging our heads for a while against the sort of brick wall of driving up turnout for young people, driving out turnout for people without college degrees. It makes sense that a polarized, hotly contested election would solve that problem. And so now the challenge of the moment is how to convert motivation and engagement into more productive forms of civic participation and mutual civic engagement. Although there is that story of polarization and division, though, we have to recognize that that story from the presidential election results looks quite different from the story we get about the electorate if we look at ballot propositions. When we look across the country at ballot propositions, we actually see an electorate that shares a lot of basic ideas. So one looks at the drug reform propositions that passed in Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, South Dakota. I think bringing to 11 or so the number of states that have legalized marijuana. Mississippi passed medical marijuana with a positive vote of 74%. So although we have a story about division and polarization, in fact, with regard to drug reform, other elements of criminal justice reform, reenfranchisement of felons, for example, in California in this election, Florida in the 2018 election, we see a sharing of perspective. So one of the things I think we have to focus on is to analyze why it is that actually as a people, there's a lot we share with regard to point of view. Yet when we look at the choice of our elected officials, we look to be incredibly divided. So what's the difference between those two kinds of voting? In my view, our electoral mechanisms are a critical difference there. I'm an advocate for ranked choice voting on the idea that it would yield more centering, less extreme candidates, that we would see less divisiveness in our choice, the agenda that we have with regard to who we pick for our elected officials. The irony there then is that ranked choice voting is something on which the American people are still themselves very much divided. So it narrowly squeaked by as a ballot proposition in Alaska. The results just came in 2 days ago, 50.8% of the vote, I believe, and it failed in Massachusetts, 45 to 55. So I think the thing we need to get rid of polarization in our election of our top level federal officials is ranked choice voting, which as it happens, we are also divided about. However, as a people, we are not comprehensively divided. That's the most important takeaway.
Great, thank you, Danielle. That is an optimistic view. Can you say a little bit more about why you're as optimistic as you are about the lack of divisiveness? I mean, when we look at the last two presidential elections, they're basically ties with pretty serious divisions between the platforms of the two candidates. So can you say a little bit more about the extent to which you think we can overcome this divisiveness with something like ranked choice voting?
Well, I think it matters, and I'd love to hear the others on the panel talk about this at some point. I think it matters that Trump won the Republican nomination in 2016, in effect, as a plurality candidate. That is, the Republican electorate was ultimately presented with an agenda that came from a more extreme wing of the party that was able to get through the nominating process because of effectively a plurality voting system in that process. Voters voting for president are facing the agenda set for them based on the structure we have that combines primaries and plurality voting systems. So we have agendas confronting voters that I think are more divided, less centering than they would be with an alternative voting mechanism in effect.
I see. Okay, so Steve, go ahead. From your perspective, what do we learn from the recent election?
So I think it's important to keep some context in mind. The first bit of context is that 2016 saw kind of realignment of sorts in the United States. Specifically, there was a shift of rural areas toward the Republicans of about 7 percentage points, which is a very big shift. And urban core areas, urban core counties, went about 4 points toward the Democrats. This is kind of the pulling apart of these two parts of the country. The second piece of context is, and it is very important to keep in mind, if you went back to January 2020, the forecasts unanimously from economists like Ray Fair, political scientists like Helmut Norpoth, historians like Alan Lichtman, all of the Wall Street forecasters all projected Trump to win, GOP Senate, and likely Republican House. The third piece of context is COVID turned this election inside out. This election was about COVID and the effect it had on the economy and the society. There were huge public health costs. There were huge economic costs. And people started to see the administration differently. And that's the shift in public opinion happens with COVID. In addition, the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests and some of the race rioting that followed had further effects on the electorate. And COVID might have fueled those because we had a very restless electorate. That takes us now to the election itself. As Danielle said, there was record turnout. Looks like it's going to settle in at about 157 million people, which is 2/3 of the eligible population. That is the adult citizens minus some people who've been disenfranchised because of felony convictions. But I'd like to share something. There's a lot of churning that goes on. I'd like to share something that shows there's also a lot of stability to this electorate. And this is a graph of the Democrats' lead in each county in 2016 against the Democrats' lead by each county in 2020. And this is a stunningly stable electorate. The red dots are every county that is 50% Hispanic or less. And the cluster is just on the line. In fact, the cluster is very tight among the Republican counties. Those are the counties that the Democrats lost by 10 points or more. The cluster is a little less tight and a little shifted upward in the counties where the Democrats won last time, especially in kind of that mid-range where they're winning about 10 to 20 to 30% of the vote. Those are the suburban counties, and that is an important factor. And then if you get to the very urban counties, which is the far end of the graph on the right, you see that, again, it's very tightly clustered. Those are the very large urban counties where the Democrats are doing very well. So there seemed to be enough of a shift from 2016 to 2020 to push the Electoral College toward the Democrats and to give Joe Biden a majority of votes, not just a plurality of votes, which is what Clinton had won last time. This represents about a 2.5% shift overall in the electorate toward the Democrats nationwide. And it's pretty uniform across the board, except in the extremely Republican and the extremely Democratic areas. With one deviation, which was kind of the surprise deviation. I was working CBS on election night in Florida, was one of my states, and I was flummoxed all night long because Miami-Dade was showing about a 15 to 20 point swing away from the Democrats. And it looked like a data error, just like it was such a big outlier. The blue dots on this graph are counties that are more than 50% Hispanic. And as you can see, almost all the blue dots, almost all the counties that are more than 50% Hispanic are shifted toward the Republicans. And that's true up and down the spectrum. And in fact, the counties where the Democrats did particularly well in 2016 are the counties where Hispanic counties where they did the worst. There are some that are clustered near the line, but most of them up and down the ballot are below the line. And this is getting a lot of focus to figure out exactly what happened. It could have been very successful organizing by the Clinton campaign. It could have been in 2016, we're just seeing a correction, or it could have been very successful organizing by the Trump campaign. Final comment that I would put out there is that 2020 witnessed the end of Election Day. And by that, I mean, since 2000, there have been various reforms that the states have enacted to make voting easier, make registration easier, open up early voting, absentee voting. Several states now are, I think it's 7 this election, are entirely vote by mail. And in 2000, about 15% of the public voted before Election Day. This election, it looks like about 60% of the people voted before Election Day. Election Day isn't Election Day. In fact, the Election Day voters, the people who get the exit poll, are the unusual voters. They're not representative anymore. And I think that this is going to be a permanent change in most states, like the Western United States will no longer vote on election day. And that shift is going to continue. And some of the complications we saw dealing with absentee voting, validating the votes and so forth are going to be part of our future going forward beyond this election.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Steve, if I could trouble you to speculate a little bit, there was a lot of talk last time about the ground game and campaign techniques. And this time there was a lot of talk along those lines, specifically to try to address this surprising result in South Florida and South Texas. Not all Hispanic or Latino districts, but especially in South Florida and South Texas, ascribing the big swing towards the Republicans to the Republican ground game. How important do you think, as someone who's looked at this, the ground game or campaign techniques have been and are likely to remain?
Well, a piece of it could be the absence of ground game, that a lot of ground game got suspended this time because of COVID. That's one of the other ways that COVID disrupted things. And a lot of the advertising that happened shifted toward television. And we haven't looked quite yet at how the Democrats did their strategizing. There did seem to be some pretty significant mobilization efforts of Hispanics and registration efforts of Hispanics in Florida and in South Texas by Republicans. And it could have been a success of the Republican Party. And there are various kind of claims made that like the stimulus checks and so forth with Trump's name on them were particularly powerful messages in the Hispanic community. So it could be the presence of a ground game by the Trump campaign or the absence of one by the Democrats, and it'll take time to sort that out. But that's something that we'll see.
Great. Ryan, your take.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And thanks. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel like this. And I particularly enjoy being joined by the alumni that are online. So I hope we hear some questions from them. I think when we have these post-election discussions, and I wouldn't apply this to any of the distinguished panelists we have here, but there's always a lot of what my students would call hot takes. And, for those of us that aren't into the lingo, those would be sort of these off-the-cuff commentary that's not really backed up by evidence. And, it seems like some of the fastest coming hot takes in these last couple of weeks have been on the Democratic performance in 2020 and even the Democrats' future electoral competitiveness. In some ways, I think these hot takes, they're kind of understandable this year because we remain in limbo, at least until January 5th, when the special election in Georgia is going to be conducted, and we know who controls the Senate. But even with that, maybe this limbo is going to go beyond January 5th, because one way or another, we're going to be facing the situation of a divided government, or at least a razor-thin Democratic margins, and Democrats' ability to govern effectively may depend on the results of the election in 2022. And that's going to affect a lot of what the result of 2020 will really mean then. So I think some speculation on the future of the Democrats is justified, and that's what I'll speak about here for a few minutes. I'm going to try to avoid pure hot takes, though, and I'll just tell you what I think we need to understand about the likely future electoral fortunes of Democrats if we really want to understand those. So I'll focus on two groups. I'll talk about two groups which are, of course, non-mutually exclusive, and these are the two groups that Steve mentioned, and a lot of other people have focused on, which is suburbanites and Latinos. And these groups really were, as Steve showed us, they're arguably electorally consequential in 2020. So sort of understanding their place in the Democratic coalition is potentially informative about Democrats' future strength. So one important starting point, I think, to point out about this, of course, is that the hand-wringing over the electoral performance of Democrats is probably overblown. As a basic fact, Joe Biden, he recorded a vote margin that's the highest against an incumbent since 1932. And he won victories in states that Democrats had previously written off, like Arizona and Georgia. And with that, Democrats, they've won the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential contests. And if you look at American history, that's a streak of electoral strength that's arguably unrivaled. And this is despite concerns about Democrats losing seats in the House, which of course is something else people have focused on. It's important to understand that Democrats, they won at historic levels in 2018. So in many ways they're being asked to defend seats in 2020 that had extended their battlefield far into areas that were normally held by Republicans. Now, all that being said, it's not all roses for Democrats, of course, because, for example, going into the election, the Cook Political Report, I was just looking at this the other day, they rated 31 House contests as toss-ups. And Democrats have lost every single one of the 27 of those that have been decided. So they're losing things in the House. 4 of those are still up in the air as far as I know. So mixed results like these, and also the fact that there was some sort of significant, if exaggerated, and we can talk about that, polling misses is one sign that things are really moving around in American politics, and that the coalitions that make up the two parties are moving around too. And so Latinos and suburbanites are 2 groups that are possibly moving around, and we can talk about those for a second. So with suburbanites, we saw signs for practically 4 years that they were moving against Trump, and indeed in 2020, all indications are they shifted heavily against them. And we could see that in some of the graphs that Steve was showing us. And arguably Biden would have lost the Electoral College without this shift by suburbanites. So for Latinos, on the other hand, the majority, we have to keep in mind that the majority of voters in the United States who identify as Latino also call themselves Democrats and voted for Joe Biden. But there's evidence that nevertheless that there's a significant shift against Trump. And as Steve mentioned, this was kind of a surprise. And for many academics and pundits out there, this shift seems to have caught us off guard, and we're still not entirely sure if the data there is telling the truth. Some further analysis is probably needed, but if I had to guess, I'd say this shift was real and that Latinos did move toward Republicans in 2020. Some people have claimed that that shift was isolated to a few states like Texas, but if you look at the data, at least the data that's available to me, it looks like this happened broadly across the US. So for example, it may not have been decisive, but it looks like this Latino vote really helped Trump to win places like Florida, and that even in places like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, Latinos moved towards Trump. So the question I think that remains is whether these movements by Latinos and suburbanites are trends that are going to continue, or whether they're one-offs from 2020. So let me consider 2 possible futures in that case. So future one is Democrats and Republicans continue a drift towards essentially changing places in the relationship with the income structure in the United States, where Republicans become the party of the working class and Democrats become the party of professionals and the wealthy. And there's some people that argue those are where the parties are drifting. And in this future, whether Latinos are part of the Democratic Party, it may really depend on whether we think politics is more heavily driven by issues of ethnic identification or by issues of class. And one possible hint that this is a possible future, despite that this shift from among Latinos is going relatively unnoticed, this drift towards Republican voting in these heavy Latino areas actually started before 2020. You can see a shift from 2012 to 2016 in a lot of these areas as well. And so it could be a long-term trend. Of course, one thing to say about if this is the future is of the parties resorting around class, we might imagine that suburbanites will remain in the Democratic fold, where their wealth and education makes them more of a natural part of that coalition. So future number 2 is that this sorting around class stops and college-educated suburbanites return to the Republican Party and working class non-white voters stay with Democrats. And if the shifts we saw among suburbanites in 2020 were mostly because of Trump, that it was him in particular that drove away suburbanites that would have otherwise been voting for Republicans, then this might be the most likely outcome that we'd expect in this post-Trump future. And in fact, the fact that Republicans performed better down ballot than they did at the top of the ballot with Trump there gives us the reason to believe that, might be the case. And of course, that future also depends on how much Republicans double down on the politics of resentment and, grievance that drove those voters away in the first place. Okay, so let me say one more thing in closing, and then I'll be quiet, which is one more point to make is I think that the future that one thinks we'll see, it depends a lot on how we characterize Trump's coalition. And I maintain that despite 4 years of hand-wringing over who voted for Trump, most Americans and academics too, they don't really have a firm grasp on Trump's appeal. And so what I mean by that is, as Steve showed us with that fantastic graph, there was a really strong correlation between 2016 and 2020. Actually, if you look at the correlation on that, it was approaching 0.99. It's almost a perfect correlation. So you could fabulously predict what happened in 2020 based on 2016. But obviously some things changed, and that's why a different party won the presidency. And so when I look at a map of those changes, the biggest shifts I see from 2016 to 2020 are in a few different places. You can see these in sort of places that you might call river valleys, like southern Texas and southern Ohio and eastern Arkansas. And then you see it in other places like the heavily Latino Miami-Dade County in Florida that Steve mentioned. And if the data holds, and I find this one really interesting, you could also see it in Rockland County, New York. And so I can tell a post hoc story that explains each one of these, but I don't really have a coherent story that explains them all. And I'm not sure anybody else exactly does either. So I think understanding these patterns of what really is a broad coalition may tell us a great deal about the appeal of Trump and whether this appeal is a particular brand of politics is larger than Trump and whether it will help to define American politics in the future.
Thanks, Ryan. That's really interesting. I want to push you, though.
Yeah.
I know that much of your work is on space, geography.
Right.
And there's, this very, very striking pattern, both in 2016 and in 2020, of the geographical distribution of support for Trump and first Clinton, now Biden. And you focused on the switches in the suburban areas, but what a naive view might be that the big cities are all Democratic and the small cities and towns and rural areas are all Republican. And Republican and Democratic in sort of 65, 70, 75 to 25 to 35. How do you explain that? Do you think that's an enduring division in American society? And where's it going? What are the implications?
Well, it's certainly a division that has become more, that has grown over the last 3 decades. One thing that from let's say 1990 to 2016, but one thing that's interesting, and we're going to have to wait till the data kind of sorts out to look at this in more detail, but it looks like 2020 was one of the last elections, or the most recent election, where that stopped accelerating, if you will. Like the distance between, let's say, if you look at a city like Philadelphia or Boston or maybe even New York, but we're waiting for those results to come in still. If you look at the distance between between Biden and Trump, it didn't accelerate over what you saw between Clinton and Trump in those areas. And a lot of this may have to do with the tremendous turnout that Danielle mentioned, that it's just that everybody turned out and voted more. But certainly those divisions didn't go away. So, as you mentioned, Jeff, they seem to be pretty firm parts of American politics. And I think, as part of those coalitions that we need to sort out if we're going to understand the future of American politics.
Great, thanks. I'm sure we'll return to some of those divisions as we move on. Roger, the view from the Charles River, it looks like.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a delight to be with this distinguished panel this evening and with our audience spanning the globe. The 2020 election was in part a reflection on what happened in 2016. For the first time in our history, we ended up electing as president someone who had never previously run for public office, had never served at the federal, state, or local level, had never served in the executive, legislative, or judicial branches, who was doing something quite different than they had ever done before in their life. And the 2020 election produced a Democratic Party candidate who was the most experienced in the legislative and executive branches of anyone we have ever had as president. Joe Biden, having served 36 years in the Senate representing Delaware, and another 8 years as vice president presiding over the Senate and acquainting himself with the executive branch of government. So he essentially replaced someone who had had no experience in government with someone who had extensive experience in government. At the same time, in this election, we continued the pattern of divided government that we have now moved into. If you take the first 70 years of the 20th century, we had a unified government, the same party in control of both houses of Congress and the White House, 56 of those 70 years. And in only 14 did we have divided government. That's 80% of the time. But if you take the period of time since 1969, we have had divided government roughly 3/4 of the time and unified government only 1/4 of the time. Joe Biden comes into the presidency as the first Democratic president in 100 years who will not enter office with, assuming that the Democrats don't sweep both seats in Georgia, but presuming he will be the first Democratic president to not enter office with Democratic majorities in both House and Senate. He does have, however, a huge advantage that I think is worth noting. When his predecessors came in, recent predecessors in the last 40 years, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, Democratic predecessors, none of them had much in the way of federal government experience. Carter and Clinton, none. Barack Obama, 4 years in the Senate. And they did not have a body of people whom they had worked with to draw from in staffing their presidency. But Joe Biden has already announced a number of people who are going to be serving on his White House staff, who know him well, whom he knows well, and who know one another well. And that is a huge advantage in getting off to a fast start when you are in office, because you don't have people, one, trying to figure out what the jobs are that they're doing, but two, they're not trying to figure out who they are going to be working with. And I think that is a great example. If you also look at the 2020 elections, you find something quite striking that has already been noted by several, a big uptick in turnout. I think this is in part the function of the capacity to vote before Election Day and to vote by mail. Over 100 million Americans did that. I view that as a very positive development. And I also view as a very positive development the big uptick in women being elected to Congress. There are 17 new Republican women members of the House of Representatives, which is an unheard of number, certainly for the Republicans. And we've now got a much broader spectrum of representation of genders as well as various ethnic groups in the Congress than we've ever had before. The big challenge for Joe Biden is going to be to see what kind of a relationship that he can establish with the Congress, which he knows well, and individuals with whom he is very familiar and acquainted, and how he is going to be able to deal with the central issue that he faces right at the outset, the pandemic. I totally agree with Steve that COVID-19 turned the election on its head, and 65% of Americans came to the conclusion that the current administration was not dealing with it effectively and that a change was needed. How he will be able to capitalize on that is an open question, but I think it's one of the most interesting features of the 2020 election. Let me stop there because I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions on a whole range of issues, but I think that gives at least a flavor of how Biden will begin.
Great. I'm not going to let you stop there. There have been some questions asked in the Q&A and some answered by our panelists for those in the audience.
Okay.
But Roger, I have, you're probably dreading this question, but I have to ask it anyway. I know you've been involved in, I believe, 3 transitions, if that's right. And
well, I've actually been involved in 5 transitions, 3 coming in and 2 going out. Okay, and the bottom line is transitioning in is a lot more fun than transitioning out.
Okay, well, I was focusing on the happy transitions in. So, given what's been going on, as we all know, what are the likely implications of what certainly already has been a delayed movement towards a transition and what may be a severely hamstrung transition going forward?
Life should be filled with graceful entries and exits, and Mr. Trump's exit is not graceful in this respect. But starting in 1962, during the Kennedy administration, when we passed the first Presidential Transitions Act, we have been looking at this question of how we should transition from one administration to another. And in fact, under law, and this is already in place, since last September, departments and agencies have been developing materials that will be handed over to the people who are appointed to the positions that they have coming in. One of the best things that's happened in American government is the transitions that we have seen most recently from Bush to Obama and from Obama to Trump. Now, those were easier transitions in the sense that they were presidents coming to the end of their second term, so that they knew that they were not running and that they were not going to be succeeding themselves. But I have looked at the transition materials that were prepared in those, and they are very high quality. And the ironic thing about transitions is, the president aside, the people who are exiting, whatever party they are in, are eager to see the people who are coming in succeed. It's one of the things that amazed me all 5 times that I was involved, because they realize how difficult the job is. They care about the particular slice of the government that they are working in. They are eager to be helpful in making sure that when the baton is passed, it is not dropped. And the fact that we have elections every 4 years does not mean that the work of government falls into slices that fit elections. So you are constantly working on things which are trying to persuade the people coming in to continue and tell them the merits of this, and we've moved this along. And I saw this over and over again, both transitioning in and transitioning out. I am persuaded, I hope this is not just wishful thinking, that a lot of that will be going on during this period of time. What the president's doing up at the top will be a little different. He's more different than any other president that we have had. But what is working down at the ground level, I'm told by many people who I've spoken with, is in fact going on just the way you would expect it would be, and there should be a fairly smooth transition. But the public version of it above the sea waves is certainly anything but that.
Okay, well, that's an optimistic view, which I'm glad for. Theda, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and it's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished and wide-rangingly informed set of panelists, and I look forward very much to the discussion. Let me just make a few points. I agree that the most striking thing about this election, as a first cut, is the massive turnout. Now, massive not by international standards, massive by the poor turnout standards of eligibility that have pertained for decades in US politics. But to have 2/3 of the eligibles turn out, the largest turnout since about 1900, is a remarkable thing, especially since it happened in a moment where many people could feel a lot of inconvenience and even health threat about participating. The turnout was massive on both sides. And I have to say that when I look at it, I see it as in many ways a culmination of 2 waves of citizen organizing and re-engagement that have unfolded in American politics over the last decade. Remember that in 2008, when Barack Obama, a highly unusual president in the eyes of many at the other end of the spectrum, and frightening to many of them, was elected along with Democrats controlling both houses of Congress, that moment helped to spur a Tea Party movement that was not just about the elites that appeared on television, but was about some 2,000, my research group now estimates, 2,000 named volunteer groups meeting regularly, spread all across the 50 states and across most types of communities, from urban to rural, from liberal to conservative within those states. And those Tea Party people went on to push a new kind of issues to the fore in the Republican Party's governance, particularly immigration restriction, but some of the kinds of to hell with them all stances that helped to fuel the core of Trump's movement within the Republican Party in 2015 and 16. Then in 2016, just 8 years later, another highly unusual, I'm being tactful, man won the presidency in a less expected way at the moment, backed by two houses of Republicans who seemed poised to go along with an agenda of radical reversal of much of what the Obama agenda had accomplished and movement in directions that seemed very frightening, terrifying, in fact, to many liberal-minded Americans. And we saw immediately, in that case, within days, the launching of grassroots groups across the country that once again met regularly. And my research group estimates up to 3,000 of them at the height. Once again, and this is more surprising on the liberal side, organized not in just liberal states and liberal districts and college towns, but in communities of all sizes and partisan stripes across the land. Obviously, the activists who organize and attend and follow the workings of these kinds of groups are a minority of the population, but I do think that the activism helped to raise the moral stakes that we saw come to a clash in this election, in which both sides felt that the very nature of America, its past and its future, were on the ballot. I do not think this is an economically determined election. Now, let me go on and comment on Ryan's very wise point that the pandemic upended this. I think it did, of course. It upended President Trump's chances to get the kind of reelection we would expect of an incumbent president in an economically growing economy. I think it would have been more of a fight than that kind of model would predict, even if the pandemic had not occurred. But the other thing I want to say about the pandemic is I don't think we understand its effects yet. And I've been very convinced in the last month or so that the major narrative that most of us in academia and most in the liberal ranks believe about the pandemic, that it showed President Trump as a failure as a leader, was true for what turned out to be the majority of the electorate this time. But it was not the way. The pandemic worked another way among many of the middle income, white, non-metropolitan voters who turned out for Trump in 2016 and upped their turnout in many cases to keep pace with the other side in this election. And I think a lot of those people, particularly the men among them, the working-aged men among them, found the strongman message that we should brush this off, forget about those masks and those prissy experts that are telling us to close all our businesses and get back to work, found that message appealing, particularly since President Trump is one of the most skillful purveyors of hopes and resentments that American politics has ever seen. And he is a quintessentially American kind of seller of false hopes and dreams. Does it very well. So let me just say two more things. This was a suburban election in many ways, in the sense that I've looked closely at the state of Pennsylvania, where I have detailed data on both the Tea Party, the resistance, and what has happened in every single county. And it was the swing toward Biden in those collar counties surrounding Philadelphia County and in the areas of Allegheny County that are suburban that provided the little extra oomph. But two counties, Erie and Northampton, flipped in Pennsylvania. And in most of the counties, even the most rural ones, Biden did a little better than Clinton. And one thing we have not mentioned mattered in that state and in many others, which is third and fourth party candidates did not capture much of anything in this election. I think the final thing I would like to say is that the divisions that have been reinforced in many ways in this election, especially at the presidential level, but the divisions that allow both parties to claim many victories in this election mean that we're in for at least another 10 to 15 years of highly polarized, high moral stakes politics in this country. And people have commented on the Democrats. I think the question I want to understand better awaits much better data down to the precinct level, which is how much of the down ballot shortfalls for the Democrats have to do with people voting only the top of the ticket. And that may have been influenced by the inability of Democratic groups to go door to door during the pandemic. And how much of it was conscious ticket splitting, which surely happened to some degree in the suburban rings. That's going to say something about the kind of balancing act Democrats are going to have to execute going forward to hold on to what was a solid, but nevertheless, iffy electoral college victory. But I find the Republican Party the most interesting. And let me just say here that David Frum has just written a very interesting essay called "There is no Trumpism without Trump." And I think that poses the question very clearly. It's pretty obvious that Donald Trump has an intense, charismatic personal relationship with about half of his voters. Are they going to stick with the Republicans, turn out for Republicans when Donald Trump is not on the ballot? And no, I don't think Donald Trump is going to be on the ballot in 2024. I think he's going to tease that and keep the money flowing and keep as much attention as he can keep from his Mar-a-Lago exile for as long as he can. But that's going to create some really tough dilemmas for elected Republicans and for Republicans who have to run in districts that are not simply 2/3 Trumpists, Trump loyalists going forward. So how are they going to manage that? And, I think it's possible that we'll begin to see a movement toward a situation in which we have a liberal party and a conservative party and something that looks more like the occasional compromises and the clashes over more versus less government, or some of the values that government pursues that people yearn for. But I don't think that's likely, because I think the Republican Party, about 2/3 of it, both at the elite and the mass level, remains entrenched with the idea of using the institutional mechanisms of the Electoral College, the Senate, and the ability to manipulate votes and how they're counted and how they are registered, even by dividing up districts within states, to entrench minority rule in this country. I don't think that experiment has been defeated yet. I think there'll be plenty of oomph behind trying it. I just don't know how it's going to go when Trumpists who are not Trump try to be at the helm. I can't quite imagine Tom Cotton inspiring the same level of passion as Donald Trump. So let me leave it at that.
Well, Theda, I take your point about Erie County. Erie County frustrated me for a long time because I was watching it carefully as a bellwether, but it didn't mean anything until over 3 days after the election. None of the results were meaningful. So very frustrating. I want to push you on something that really wasn't your focus. It was in the background. I know that you and your research team have spent a lot of time immersed in the lives and desires of those in the industrial heartland and the small cities and towns, many of which are the backbone of support for Trumpism, perhaps, or the Republican Party. And I guess my question is, what would a new administration need to do to start addressing their concerns? Is that out of the question for moral or other reasons, or is it something that's feasible?
Well, I don't think any Democratic president is going to create a great conversion in the non-metro areas in which the Republican Party is now solidly rooted. And that's because it's not just a question of individual people adding up their pluses and minuses about an individual politician or the economic policies. It's because the way of life in a lot of these areas is centered in church networks and in gun clubs and in just a sense that one's neighbors all agree on what makes for a good citizen and a threat to America, which many people in these areas believe that, or, you know, all of us on this panel are a threat to America, and that and their worldview, which I obviously have to struggle to understand when I interview people face to face, is nevertheless heartfelt, and it is just as much a moral worldview about the meaning of America and who's a threat to it as people in Cambridge, Massachusetts may have in a different direction. But I do think that, let me just say that I think Joe Biden is the one Democrat who has a chance to solve the biggest threats he faces going forward and the Democrats face going forward. One threat is that Mitch McConnell is going to try to run an Obama 2 on this guy. He is going to try to make sure that there are not monies allocated, which require congressional votes, to deliver some of the security and economic help that particularly the urban constituents, but really many middle income and working class people have suffered terribly in this pandemic. And many of them are going to be suffering more going forward as the long-term effects of this play out. And I don't think we've seen anything yet in terms of the long-term shifts in industries and occupations, in types of work, in family security, and women's chances to go to work. So Biden has the right policies to deliver, but they all cost money, and I'm not sure he's going to have the money. On the other hand, Biden is going to be associated with the delivery of the vaccines. He's going to do so much better at delivering the vaccines than Donald Trump would have done. I think Donald Trump is a wily politician, but a leader of a functioning government, he is not. And, I think that Biden, if he plays it right, will be able to get governors and mayors of both parties on board with pressure in Congress to make sure there are enough resources to deliver the public health as well as the private sector side of the vaccine administration over the next year. He will be associated with the economic recovery and the health recovery that will bring about. And perhaps he can leverage a certain amount of that into economic relief for the needed areas. And I think this guy knows how to manage congressional coalitions, how to go around Mitch McConnell better than any other Democrat possibly could. He is also a reassuring figure, even to most of those who oppose him. So I think the evidence we have is that a lot of Republicans who voted against Biden did so because they were worried about the Democratic Party's possible thrust to the left. And those worries were increased by the understandable national explosions over police malfeasance and murders that happened over the summer. I think that worries about people talking about it, Democratic advocates will press every cockamamie scheme you can imagine on the Biden administration. The Biden administration is not going to do it, and it couldn't get through most of it through Congress anyway. But that's going to be very important, because I think to hold some of these suburbanites and to hold the margins of loss down in non-metro America, we better hope, if we're Democrats, that Biden runs again, and that level of kind of center-left liberalism with some meat and potatoes payoffs is what comes to the fore during this period.
Thank you, Theda, and thanks all of you. We've gotten a lot of questions in the Q&A, many of which have been answered. I just wanted to point that out to those participating. They've been answered also in the Q&A in writing, but I want to try to bring some of those questions to the rest of you. And many of them, some of which have been answered, some of which are still in the Q&A, go back to the question that Danielle first raised, or the issue that Danielle first raised, which is divisiveness. Partisan divisiveness, racial divisiveness, other forms of divisiveness that has a lot of the people watching, at least a lot of people sending in questions and comments, concerned. So let's go back to the point that Danielle raised, and let me ask those of you who'd like to comment. Danielle's given her view, which is that political institutional reform is crucial to try to overcome some of this divisiveness. And Danielle, if you'd like to say more, feel free. But for others, what do you think are some of the main steps that need to be taken, and perhaps that could be taken by a new Biden administration, even with a potentially divided Congress, to overcome some of the partisan and other divisiveness that the country's been beset with for the last 10 or 15 years? Ryan, go ahead.
I actually don't have a good answer to this question, but I'll put some perspective on it, which is of course, is a really difficult problem. And that's why Danielle raised it. But I think one important thing to remember about this is it's easy for us to overstate the divisiveness, especially in an election year. We do have to remember, and this is an enduring fact of American politics, is that most people don't care about it as much as people that show up for a panel on a Tuesday night about an election outcome. And most Americans actually are in the middle. You can see this over and over again in the data. It doesn't really matter how much you slice that. And even when we come to sort of divisive issues, like we certainly saw in this country, the majority seems to agree on a lot of those things. It's not to say things like the George Floyd protest this summer were not divisive in a certain respect, but you saw public opinion around things like police brutality and around racial justice move quickly in a fairly uniform direction. There's always going to be a minority that disagrees, but there is a broad consensus around a lot of these issues. It doesn't mean that that plays out easily in politics because of the problems of electoral structures that we have that people like Danielle mentioned and Theda mentioned, but it's important to keep that underlying fact of this large middle in American politics in mind when we answer these questions.
This reminds me of the view that a lot of scholars have, and then Roger and Theda, which is that the divisiveness starts at the top, so to speak, from the party leadership rather than from the masses themselves. That's a view that I know a lot of Americanists hold. Roger, go ahead. You had a thought on this.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a lot of divisiveness in language and in behavior in recent years and months. But one of the things that can undermine that is people sensing that we have a common goal. Sometimes it's a common enemy, more hopefully it's a common challenge. And right now, COVID-19 is precisely that, because it doesn't matter what party or ethnicity or gender or anything that someone is, this is a genuine threat and people want to see it succeed. There are also a large number of Americans who are very concerned, Republican and Democrat, about our place in the world, who are concerned about us retreating from a leadership position that we have had essentially since the end of the Second World War. And now we have, hopefully, 2 vaccines that look enormously promising that we can use not only to help ourselves and inoculate ourselves, but that can be mass produced and distributed globally. And I see Joe Biden as someone who has spent an enormous amount of his career in the realm of foreign policy. He didn't just chair the Senate Judiciary Committee, he chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And that's where he formed his fast friendship with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. And that they have all spent a lot of time working with one another. My guess is that he will use this as an opportunity to reclaim or seek to reclaim US global leadership on a very challenging issue. And as China's rise in recent years has started to pose a threat or a perceived threat to the United States, I think that we may be able to see people building more bridges and coming together to deal with this than we have in the past. I think the relationship that he establishes with Mitch McConnell and those in the Congress is going to be very important in whether or not he's able to use his calming demeanor to, in effect, bring us together in a way that we haven't been over the last 4 years.
Great. Thank you, Roger. Theda, go ahead on this point.
You know, I agree with most of what Roger has to say about the world scene. And I do think that will have an impact on politically attuned Americans on both the moderate side of the Republican Party and the counterparts in the Democrats. So it'll have a political payoff. I want to interject a note of caution about the comment that Ryan made about this summer. My read of the survey data, and I think survey data only goes so far, is that white Americans swung enormously along with all others in the George Floyd episode and in the massive peaceful demonstrations, overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations that unfolded in the early summer. But the survey data seems to show a shift back among many whites and a partisan polarization of the reaction as you move toward the late summer and into the election season. And the other thing that's very, very tricky about the criminal justice arena is that it is easily turned into high-octane extremist symbolism by national political leaders, but the solutions have to be worked out through cooperative action that involves civic groups and citizen groups along with police forces, locality by locality, because of the way in which American criminal justice is structured. So hopefully a Biden administration will create a new framework. And I guess I've come around over the last period to thinking that the way presidents talk really matters. That the kind of talk that so many on the left in the Democratic Party find maddening about Biden is exactly what's needed to create some sense of public civic space again. But there are going to have to be some very clever engagements with an array of citizens groups in local communities across the land to address matters like criminal justice. And the final thing I'll say, we haven't mentioned, infrastructure. Infrastructure week never arrived in the Trump administration. And I don't know why. It was such an obvious move. And it's an absolutely obvious move along with responses to the pandemic for the Biden administration to make in terms to getting some recovery funds through Congress, because there's a lot of work to do, and much of it would be very satisfying to people in non-metro communities, particularly universal high-speed internet or funds for roads, for example.
Yes, well, I was glad to hear at least something about the international sector, which is what I work on, and I agree with Roger's points, and infrastructure, which I think those of us in the political economy biz regard as a central issue. Danielle, you're the one that opened this session speaking about divisiveness. Would you like to lead us through your thinking on it?
Sure, I'm happy to add a couple more thoughts. I think this is to, in some sense, repeat things others have said, but I do think the question of the relationship between where the center of gravity is in popular opinion and how politicians set an agenda is key. I do think, as Roger said, the center of gravity of the American people is pretty much weighted in the center. And I do think that the ballot propositions show that in important ways. I mean, another one I like to point to is the Mississippi proposition to replace the flag, right? Where getting rid of all emblems of the Confederacy is sort of a vote of 72%. So that really goes against the narrative that we don't have a way of having a kind of shared vision about a future that moves past our past. So I do think we have that capacity as a people, and it really is about the kind of agendas politicians put out there. And I do think in that regard, we have to be honest about the fact that Trump, and then not him alone, also sort of politicians on the left, drove a very divisive framing of choices with regard to what our prospects could be as a country. But I also actually want to really double down on the point that Theda made about the need for people to work in municipal and county contexts. And I actually think that what the pandemic gives us is a real opportunity to reimagine federalism. So I've been collaborating with a crew of people trying to sketch out a vision of what we call collaborative federalism. And it basically recognizes that, the language of the sort of Federalist Papers, the point of the federal structure is to harmonize across the levels. We forget that that word harmonization was really important to the original conception. And the way to think about it is, if you start by actually figuring out what the solution should be at the local level and work out the solution, then the question of what the role of the state and the federal government is a question of what supports do you need at the state and federal level to deliver this thing that you've discovered locally is the solution. And so you can let local problem solving drive policy and still build federal policy frames out of that. But it's a very different model from what we have, which is sort of started with a kind of a priori national blueprint and then trying to drive it down. So I do think that the pandemic, particularly because of how our health infrastructure is structured, has opened up an opportunity to do a lot more with collaborative federalism in a really positive direction.
Great, thanks. So a lot of the questions from the Q&A from the audience have been about divisiveness, some of which have now been addressed. There's a series of questions which are related, I think, and they go in the direction of asking what we think the impact is likely to be of the more extreme, for want of a better word, wings of the two parties, whether it's the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or the Trump wing, I suppose you might say, of the Republican Party or in the media. Are they likely, in either case, whether from the Democratic left or the Republican right, to be a serious obstacle to a Biden administration, which seems to be heading towards the center, at least on many policies? And more generally, are they going to be an obstacle to addressing some of the problems that the country faces? How seriously, people are asking, should we take the fact that both the Democratic and Republican parties seem quite divided within themselves between the more moderate center-left, center-right wings and the more extreme left and right wings? Anyone interested in taking that one on? Theda, go ahead.
All right, so my research colleagues and I approach these questions in a way quite different from everybody else here, because we look not at attitudes of categories of people, voters, but we look at organizations. And we are particularly interested in the forces promoting extremism, regardless of what most American citizens may want. So let me just stipulate that I think there's a lot of evidence that most American citizens do not pay constant attention to politics, or at least don't want to, and that they are at least of mixed views and ambivalent views in many cases, if not moderate. But there are extremist forces pushing on both parties. On the Democratic side, the progressive left, let's take somebody like Justice Democrats that just put out a manifesto starting to bash President-elect Biden before he even has a transition in place formally, before he has even made most of his appointments, claiming that they helped to elect him and therefore they want this, this, and this, and not this, this, and that. So I think that the progressive left is a professional advocacy left. It is centered in a few metropolitan and very liberal areas. It is based on very unrealistic ideas about what can be attained politically. For example, the activists in Minneapolis who pushed defund the police as a slogan did not even find out that they didn't have the capacity in their city charter to actually vote for that. So they pushed the slogan, but couldn't even do the reality in their own bailiwick, let alone take into account the effect that might have on the balancing act that the Democratic Party above all has to do between people toward the middle and people on the liberal sides who are unevenly spread across the political geography in a way that puts them at a disadvantage in the Electoral College. Now, let me just quickly say that on the right, extremist forces are much more powerful. And there are two forms of them. There are top-down, ultra-free market, billionaire-backed forces that have pushed the Republican Party's agenda toward tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, a refusal to acknowledge or deal with global warming, union busting, and vote suppression. And those forces are very happy to see a Senate that, as one of them put it, will be the goalie that will prevent Biden from achieving liberal, let alone progressive goals. The other force we've been talking about is much more popularly grounded, and it is a Christian nationalist and ethno-nationalist force that is primarily concerned with a sense of resentment about the decline in the areas in which they live and fear of racial, generational, and immigration-fueled changes in the United States. Both of those forces will keep many elected Republicans from cooperating with a lot of what a moderate Democrat is going to want to do, no matter how good Joe Biden is at schmoozing with people he's known all his life.
Good. Roger, go ahead.
One thing that struck me during the years that I spent in Washington was the extent to which members of the House and Senate were truly keyed in to the interests of their districts and their states.
Mm-hmm.
And they loved to present themselves as problem solvers. They loved to be able to bring things back home. If you wanted to try to move them in one direction or another, you developed a whole array of statistics to show how this was going to affect their particular constituents in positive ways. If you look at the first 4 COVID relief packages, they passed virtually unanimously in both houses. The reason why is they were brilliantly constructed, actually in pretty short order, brilliantly constructed, so that everybody could walk away saying that they had voted for something they knew was going to be popular at home.
Right.
We're going to have some more COVID relief packages. We're not going to be getting out of this quickly. So there will be probably several COVID relief packages that can do the work of bringing people together and then have attached to them particular things that will benefit not simply the short run, but the longer run. And as Jeff points out, one of these is infrastructure. If you go talk to Republicans and Democrats, right and left, everybody is concerned that we've got a huge infrastructure challenge that's not being met. I had the opportunity of working on the largest surface transportation bill to that point. It was in 1990 and was about $250 billion. And we were able to get Republicans and Democrats to come together to vote. You had to give things to both sides and people in urban areas as opposed to people in rural areas, et cetera. But that's not a hard one to reach agreement. And if you look at what Mitch McConnell, Joe Biden, and others who are there want, they don't want just gridlock. They want to be able to do something that they can take home. And I think infrastructure and COVID relief are two big things that Joe Biden can push hard at the beginning and can demonstrate that he, in fact, can work with the Congress. And there's a little bit of this momentum that builds that will enable other things to happen later and to defeat. I think Theda is absolutely correct that we've got a lot of groups out there who are just sort of locked into being opposed on both the right and the left. But I think they get overwhelmed when people view a common objective where they can see their own lives really being improved. And I think COVID-19 relief and infrastructure fit that bill.
Bring back the pork.
Ryan, go ahead.
So one comment on this is I admire Roger's optimism on this, and I hope that he's correct. But I do believe there's reason to think that the politics of what's practical has changed, and it could change back. Don't get me wrong. But if we use the last half year as evidence, every piece of political science research in the world would tell you that an incumbent party should deliver relief for its voters during times they're struggling. And this is exactly what Roger was talking about. People like stuff in their pockets. They want relief, and yet it couldn't be delivered. If for any objective perspective, the country was crying out for it, and it needed to be delivered, and it wasn't. And we could ask, there could be a lot of reasons that goes into it. And it could be because those extremist elements of the parties are just controlling what's going on in Washington too much. Maybe there'll be some swing back to the center, but at least the last 6 months don't make me terribly hopeful that we're going to see a big rush of coronavirus relief and even infrastructure, even though it's badly needed.
Danielle, go ahead.
Can I jump in that? Just I'll focus on the coronavirus piece, just because I've spent so many hours working on this question for the last 7 months. But I mean, the thing that was really striking about the fights over COVID relief from July until the election was the fact that the question of coronavirus relief was completely glued to the question about integrity of the voting system, funding for the post office, various requirements and provisions for states to ensure that the mail-in absentee ballot process would work, and so forth. And that is why there was no movement on coronavirus relief. And the Republicans stalled on the Democrat package precisely in order to win on that feature of what was in the package. And so in that regard, I do think we will see coronavirus relief because that blockage is now gone, the election's behind us. But I do think it also underscores how deep and profound the fight is now about our electoral systems, and how we treat them in the wake of the end of the Voting Rights Act. And so I think we cannot underestimate the degree to which that will continue to be a source of conflict in our politics. So I'm really with Theda on the view that we are going to see significant partisan conflict for the next 10 to 15 years. This is not the beginning of the end. This is the beginning of the beginning.
Yeah. And that we've left the state level out here.
The end of the beginning.
They're heavily under the control.
Roger.
End of the beginning, that's it.
Well, no one, I think, would quarrel with the fact that the closing months leading up to the election produced a lot of gridlock and people trying to position themselves. I remember the Rodney King riots in May of 1992. And we got Mayor Bradley and the governor of California, Pete Wilson, and Peter Rubroth. And they came back and we met with the joint congressional leadership. And the president was eager to share the credit, et cetera. And we had gridlock in trying to push anything through because it was in the last 6 months leading up to an election. All new beginnings are hopeful, however, and I think that there is an opportunity at the beginning of a fresh new administration for people to work well with one another. And a lot of this is going to depend on the tone that Joe Biden sets in his inaugural address and in his first address to a joint session of Congress. So far, he has been remarkably restrained in commenting on what's happening during the transition. He seems to be calm, he seems to be competent. This is going to serve him well. I remember vividly coming off the stand at the inaugural in 1989, when George Bush was elected, with larger opposition majorities facing him than any president in US history. And I overheard a conversation between Daniel Patrick Moynihan and another Democratic senator as we were coming off. In his inaugural address, he had offered the extended hand. I want to build bridges. I want to work with you. Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, and he was going to be chairing the Senate, or he was a ranking member, was going to succeed Lloyd Bentsen as the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. But he said to his colleague, I think this is someone whom we can work with. During the first 2 years, there was a lot of good work that got accomplished, whether it was on the environment, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the budget agreement, et cetera. When you get very close to elections, it's extraordinarily hard to get people to come on common ground. And that's why I'm not surprised that after 4 COVID relief packages, the 5th one was just a bridge too far. I don't think that is going to be the case. We might even see one in the lame duck session, but certainly in January, if the projections, healthcare projections that we see about the COVID-19 virus spreading are true, I think this will be a moment where people can come together and find common ground, and that can be a good beginning for both parties.
Great. Well, we have just 5 minutes left, so I want to put all of you on the spot. There are a number of questions that we're not going to be able to get to in the Q&A. A bunch have been answered in writing. Unfortunately, there are a bunch of questions about the international sector, which is what I'm primarily interested in, but we won't have a chance to get to those. What I want to do is put you all on the spot for just a couple of sentences, no more than 30 or 45 seconds, of what lessons should our listeners, viewers, take away from the 2020 election about the future of the country, about the implications of the election for American politics. And I'll start with, since I do want to get the international sector at least mentioned, by saying that I think that, among other things, this election it has had and will have a fundamental impact on America's role in the world, that another 4 years of the Trump administration would have profoundly changed the international economic and political order, and that we are now going to move back towards something that we are more familiar with in the post-war world. So that's my summary, but I'll go around in the order in which we started. And Danielle, what should our viewers take away from the 2020 election as a portent of the future?
Well, I hope people will take a motivation to see this as a moment of true opportunity. This is, from my point of view, the chance for us to build the America we should be. As I said, the whole electorate participated. Young, old, people without college degrees, people with college degrees, people of color, white Americans. And so really, we face that hard job of building a genuine, stable, multicultural democracy. And I think this is the moment for all of us to gird our loins and work hard on achieving that together.
Great. Steve?
I think there's a kind of stuckness to American politics now. I don't know if it's polarization, but the amount of legislation over the past 10 Congresses, the amount of legislation passed is down. We've had these very close elections. And there is a sense in which we've kind of settled into this equilibrium of accepting less from our government. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will be more moderate voice and try to pull folks together. He understands the Senate better than either of the past 2 presidents, maybe any of the presidents in recent memory, all the way back to Bush, George H.W. Bush. And I think that's a hopeful thing because he's got to deal with the Senate. The only way to get laws passed right now is to deal directly with the Senate and to kind of make smart choices about what to lead with. So I'm hopeful, but I do think we're in this stuck place, and it is an equilibrium that we're not getting out of anytime soon.
I'd say there's a potential energy around American politics that was harnessed in this election in a way it hasn't been in a long time. And we saw excitement. It could have been because of a particular candidate, but it was hard to imagine for most of my lifetime, I think a lot of people's lifetime, about people dancing in the streets when somebody loses. And that is a meaningful thing to see in American politics. And if it continues towards people passing legislation, doing things that Danielle said, perhaps can provide for the future that America wants, then we could see this as a really meaningful place in American politics and perhaps a turning point.
I think that we should view the 2020 election as a great achievement in energizing the electorate in an extraordinarily peaceful and violent-free atmosphere in which a country relatively evenly divided has come to the conclusion that there is a big threat out there that we're going to have to deal with. COVID-19, the economy, and our place in the world. I think we've got people on both sides of the aisle who recognize those as central priorities, who know one another, and who I think have a good chance to work well with one another. So I'm a cautious optimist that we will emerge from this experiment where we're essentially turning back to experience in government as what we want to rely on. And it's not just good personal relations between many of the participants, but it's the notion that we've got to pull up our socks as a country because the path that we're on now is not going to take us where we want to go.
Okay. And Theda for the last word.
You know, the citizen side of me agrees with all the hopeful things that people have said here, particularly Danielle and Roger. The realist side of me says that this election was a very, very important inflection point on a series of clashes about the direction of American democracy that are going to continue for quite some time. And I think that a lot depends on whether more Americans see themselves as a part of a we that are tackling challenges together about the COVID threat and the economic, I'm not going to just say recovery, but reinvention. This crisis is forcing upon us. But I also know as a realist that there are different we's highly mobilized at both the elite and the popular level now. And those who would like to redouble on the Trumpist version of America, which is a wall-building, ethno-nationalist country, have some very important levers that they can still pull to try to discourage and cool out democratic participation, small d, as well as high d. And they will redouble their efforts, particularly at the level of the states. And for that moderate middle to prevail, those extremists are going to have to be defeated 2 more times.
Well, there you have it. We run the gamut, I think, from cautious optimism to grudging pessimism. And of course, on everyone's part, complete realism. And I thank you all, especially to the 5 of you, for participating. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. It's one of many that we will be having over the coming years about the state of American politics. I thank our alumni for watching on the Alumni Channel. And I thank all of the rest of you for participating. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I was happy to see that 25 of them, I think, were answered in writing while we were moving. So thanks again for coming. Thanks for attending. And especially thanks to the 5 of you for favoring us with your wisdom and experience.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Everyone.
And thanks to the audience. Thank you. I wish we could see you. Yeah.